Good evening. My name is Haya Ajan. I'm a faculty at Elon University, and I'm also a Syrian American. Thank you all for making the time to join us today. I would like to start by thanking Dr. Brian Pennington and Elon's Centers for the Study of Religion, Culture, and Society for sponsoring our event this evening. It's an honor to appear before you and present our distinguished guests in our event. The Syrian war has spiraled from a popular uprising demanding changes in the security establishment in March 2011 to an international conflict that has drawn in regional and international power and destroyed large portions of my home country, Syria. It has also destabilized countries in Europe, as well as spawned the most poisonous form of Islamist extremism yet seen. Back in 2011, no one understood how far the Assad regime was willing to go to maintain its control over Damascus. No one foresaw that half the country would be displaced from their homes. No one foresaw that a huge refugee crisis would reach Europe. No one anticipated that Al-Qaeda organization would split and that a more extreme form would come to control the eastern portions of Syria going into Iraq. The Syrian people are suffering. Currently, the UN estimates 11.3 million Syrians are displaced, which is roughly equivalent to all residents of Ohio being forced out of their homes. Grimmest of all is the climbing death figure, now believed to be more than 500,000 deaths. For more than 5 years, the Syrian conflict has crossed the threshold of mass atrocities, featuring widespread crimes against humanity, including the use of chemical weapons and the intentional targeting of religious groups. The Syrian American Medical Society has documented 161 chemical attacks, leading to the death of 1,491 people, including many children, and also more than 14,000 injuries. In fact, just in August of this year, a medical facility was attacked every 16 hours in Syria. While there are so many fighting forces on the ground, almost 91% of these attacks are carried out by the Assad regime. Many of my friends come out of Syria and describe the situation in besieged areas as 10 times worse than hell. According to the UN, some 600,000 people live in besieged areas. Vast majority of these innocent civilians are besieged by the regime. Using near identical tactics, they surround the city, cut off humanitarian aid, and give civilians inside 3 choices: starve, be bombed, or surrender. A few weeks ago, the city of Daraya, outside Damascus, chose the latter. It's important to note that according to the UN, only 3 of the 18 besieged areas in Syria are being cut off by terrorist groups and opposition. And actually the remaining 15, accounting for approximately 78% of those besieged, are encircled by the Assad regime. To civilians living in besieged areas, it matters little who's besieging them. What matters is the hellish suffering it imposes on them and their loved ones. To be a parent whose children are so hungry that they cannot sleep at night. To be a doctor who's forced to watch your patient die of treatable illness or disease because you don't have the treatment or the equipment. To be a first responder like those of the white helmets who day after day you're picking the bodies of civilians from the rubble of hospitals and apartment buildings. Today in Syria, the suffering of civilians is being used as a tactic of war. Joining us to shed more light on the complex events in Syria is our distinguished guest speaker. Dr. Ghadbian is Special Representative to the United States for the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces. He's a pro-democracy activist and an academic. He's an associate professor at Arkansas University. He's also the founding member of the Syrian National Council, SNC. Without further ado, please help me welcome our special guest.
Great, thanks. So perhaps you can begin by just setting the stage for us. So, some people in this room may be very familiar with the conflict. Others will be simply being introduced to it. So what is your first version of the conflict in Syria? Where did it stem from? Where does it stand today? And who are the major players?
Maybe it's a good point to start with the picture behind me. Just to refocus the conflict on the essence of it. And that is, you have a population that rebelled against an oppressive regime. And the regime continued to use all tactics to put down this rebellion. This is a peaceful protest, continuation of the so-called Arab Spring, started in March of 2011. Then a history of continued brutality, crimes against humanity, war crimes, regional intervention, international paralysis on the part of the key players, the United Nations, that allowed this to go on for so long. So I would like to bring you back again to some of the facts and figures that Professor Ajahn mentioned about the casualty, about the cost of this war, and again, to remind everyone that, in fact, there's something we can do about it. So that's my starting point.
Great, thanks. So can you tell us who the major players in this conflict are right now?
I think it's a good way to divide this conflict into the three levels. The local, the regional, the international. At the local level, you have three players. On one side, you have the majority of Syrians who took to the street on March 11th and wanted change, wanted basic, even though the word regime carries negative connotation, but really what they wanted to do is a change in the constitution, change from one-party rule that's been the Syrian regime since 1963 into multi-party rule, from, like the rule of one family, mafia, into rule of law, from a state that's dominated by one institution, that is the security agency, it's called mukhabarat, into a state that's controlled by different, in fact, multiple groups that represent the society. So that's the one side that, in fact, I would say the majority of Syrians belong to this camp. Today, they are the overwhelming majority of the refugees, the internally displaced, and some who live under the regime control. Then you have the regime side. And the regime does have a base, and I think this is an important point to make. A base of I would say that maybe some of the minorities in Syria continue to support the regime. Some of them out of fear, some of them out of their brainwash, and some of them who benefit from the continuation of this regime. There are, of course, some segment of the Syrian majority population, the Sunnis, who support the regime. But I would say this is a minority, as if we talk in terms of demographic figures. And then the third local player are the extremists. This group did not exist when the uprising began, but they found fertile ground, especially with the failure of the international community to respond to the protection of civilians after the regime continued to use all kinds of weapons, which started with snipers, escalated into artillery, tanks, air force. You mentioned the chemical weapons used against Syrians. And that, I think, allowed the extremists to have a footing in Syria. And this third group is one of them called the Nusra Front, which is affiliated with Al-Qaeda. The other one is the infamous ISIL. Everybody heard of ISIL. They originated in Iraq, moved into Syria, and now they control large part. The good news is this group is actually losing ground. So this is the local level. I'm going to be quick here. At the regional level, you have the countries of the region divided. And if you look at the map, even though very few countries support the regime, their support is very effective and genuine. On the regime side, you have Iran is a key player and has been committed to the survival of the regime. They provided weapons, they provided advisors, soldiers, they recruited a lot of militias from all over the world to come and support the regime. The most importantly, Hezbollah, a very well-known group in Lebanon, that in fact, yesterday, according to Israeli sources, Hezbollah lost more than 1,600 fighters in Syria, more than all of their losses with the wars with Israel, over 30 years of war with Israel. So these are fighting on the regime side. The other countries, Turkey, the Arab countries, are more supportive of the Syrian opposition, mostly the moderate opposition. And internationally, you have a divide between Russia from one hand, with support from China, and the rest of the international community, United States, European Union, other countries, which in fact did support an early change in Syria, but they have not been as committed as Russia and Iran to the side of the regime. So this is a summary of the players of Syria. I don't know if this is helpful.
Okay, great. So in an earlier conversation today, you mentioned at one point that there was recently 96 individual groups who were signatories to one particular agreement, indicating the great number of groups and factions that are on the ground who have an interest in this conflict and its outcome. So, I mean, this is a tremendously factionalized conflict. Is that the case?
I think it's not necessarily factionalized as much as localized. Mm-hmm. One of the strengths of the opposition at one point was the fact that you have people, if you look at the map, people who are defending Aleppo against the regime and its allies are the people of Aleppo. Those who are fighting in Damascus, they are from Damascus. Those who are in the center, they are from the center. And I think that was both a weakness and a strength. The weakness was it's hard to have a national strategy. So if one region is attacked, you don't necessarily get the other region to come and help. But the strength of it is that these people are committed to defending their houses, their families, their properties, their lives. And I think that's why the regime has not been effective in regaining a lot of the territories that they lost. Now, there is a divide in Syria between ideologically, maybe you could say, secular forces and the Islamic forces. I would say at the beginning of the revolution, most of the forces were kind of closer to being secular nationalists. I think all the slogans of the era indicated into that. As the conflict continued, as more death, as more destruction, as more brutalities, crimes committed, people naturally turned to religion. And so you find most of the groups fighting today, they have some Islamic references. But again, those are still the moderate. As I said, the extremists, those who are committed to ideologies like Al-Qaeda are Al-Nusra and ISIS. And again, I would make a distinction between these two groups. Al-Nusra would have more Syrian following for some reasons, the fact that they fought the regime more than ISIS. But nonetheless, their leadership is committed to that vision of Al-Qaeda.
So I want to ask you about some of the moderate forces, and maybe three in particular. So some of them that we hear about often on the news are, first of all, your organization, the Coalition for Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, the Free Syrian Army, and those who have read the news today about what's coming out of London will have heard of the High Negotiations Committee. So can you talk, first of all, a little bit about the coalition and how it came about, what it represents, and what its relationship to these other groups are?
From the title, the coalition, it means it's a collection of different groups. It came out of discussions and deliberations that lasted more than 2 years after the revolution. The main idea of it is the commitment into a different Syria, the new Syria, democratic, civil Syria, pluralistic Syria. It included most of the politically active group from even before the revolution. It tried to unify the inside and the outside. Before the formation of the coalition, I think we were told that many of the Syrian activists live in exile. They're not in Syria. They don't know what's happening. But eventually, I think that divide was crossed and bridged easily because the regime would not tolerate any internal dissent. So many of our activists who spent times in prison, who were leading in the revolution, were forced outside, and some of them went back and forth. In addition to the political forces, we had, I think, one important group in the coalition. These are called the local councils. And the local councils is a phenomenon created by the population of Syria. Some of them were already providing services to these areas, and they found themselves taking charge. So representatives of local councils from the 14 provinces are represented in the coalition. And then some of the military, moderate military groups were included in the coalition. When the coalition was formed, it was formed in 2013. There was a hope that there would be a political solution, political process. That's why most countries of the world recognize the Syrian coalition as the representative of the Syrian people. There was a group called the Friends of Syria, which reached at its highest 114 countries, with the US among them, recognized the coalition as representing the Syrians, which allowed actually the Assad regime to be marginalized and isolated internationally. Many of those countries already severed diplomatic relations with the Assad regime. The US, for instance, announced as early as May 2011 that Obama said Assad must go. And that gave a strong message to the Syrians to go on with their struggle. Most of the European countries, most of the Arab countries. In fact, if you look at the record of voting in the General Assembly of the United Nations, when you have something good for Syria, we usually get about 130 to 140 votes in the UN. There are about 19 votes with the regime, and those are, I could easily say, the rogue nations of the world. Russia, North Korea, Cuba, Iran, you name it. And then some countries abstain in Latin America and in Africa. So in that sense, I think we were always on the right side of things. And most of the international community gave us, really all the verbal support and all of the, they were saying all the right things in terms of the people of Syria having the right to fulfill their aspirations, including to choose their rights, the right to choose their government, which is one of the Universal Declaration's rights included in the, in the UN Charter. So that, I think, the coalition. Now, the Free Syrian Army is the military unit that mostly defected from the Syrian army because they refused to open fire at their fellow citizens, sometimes joined by civilians. And it's a really broad coalition. And as I said, they are highly localized. They are led by local leaders in every province. The High Negotiations Commission or Committee, something created recently from the coalition and other groups, including the military groups, most of the military groups that are committed for a political solution. And it was created within a process, the process of the International Syria Support Group, which is about 21 countries that are involved in Syria. And they asked, particularly one country, Saudi Arabia, to invite all of those groups into a conference in Riyadh, which they did. They formed this commission. And today, as you said, they announced their vision for a transition in Syria, consistent with all of the UN resolutions and the UN framework.
Right. So until this week, you were planning on traveling here with your colleague, Ubab Khalil, who has been a regular visitor to Elon in the past, and then he was called to London to work on these negotiations. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, it's not the negotiations as much as today they presented that vision to some of the Friends of Syria, about 7 countries. And I think it's a leading news on Al Jazeera, if you look at that. I doubt it would make it into the local news here, but I think...
So can you talk a little bit about this vision? What is it setting forth as a possible path to a free and democratic Syria?
Gladly. This vision is based on 2 maybe previous documents. One is called the Geneva Communique. And the Geneva Communique is an agreement in June of 2012 between the US and Russia, which tried to provide a framework for solving the Syria conflict. It envisioned mostly the creation of a transitional governing body made up of both sides of the conflict, that is, the opposition and the regime. that transitional governing body would be created by mutual consent. That is, from our point of view, we have to agree to those who represent the other side, and the other side could have veto on those of us who are not acceptable. For us, from day one, our main criterion of who should be included or excluded was those who committed crimes against humanity and those who committed war crimes. And we clearly said, and I think this was elaborated in the statement today, that we don't accept the participation of anyone who belongs to a terrorist organization or anyone who committed war crimes as defined by the Commission of Inquiry of Syria, which is a UN commission. To us, Bashar al-Assad, the head of the regime, is at the top of that list. And I think one of the major problems of finding a solution is the fact that we always had a veto on accepting a role for Bashar al-Assad in the transitional period. Now, in today's statement, in today's vision, we agreed that we are going to negotiate with Bashar al-Assad. We have to. I mean, we can't negotiate with ourselves. So we agreed to, include and whoever the regime delegation might be to do that. I think that we said that in the transitional period, and this negotiations period should last 6 months, then the transitional period in which there will be the formation of the transitional governing body of both sides, and we had a criteria and who should be included and who shouldn't, from our point of view, should exclude Bashar al-Assad and the top war criminals and those who committed crimes against humanity. But we realized that, this is a matter, again, the UN can play a role, can decide. I want to address this question of Bashar al-Assad, because many people say, what's your problem with Bashar al-Assad? I mean, is it worth all of these sacrifices, all this, cost for one person? Well, my simple answer is twofold. Number one, as a matter of principle, a person who displaced half the population, a person who's responsible for most of the killing, the 500,000, a person who, to start with, was not a legitimate president, was never elected. He inherited power from his father and lost every legitimacy once he killed Syrians. He used chemical weapons. He used every possible crimes against humanity that exist in the book. Of course, will not be acceptable. And this is, again, this is not the perspective of one opposition group. I think if you take a survey among Syrians, the majority of Syrians would agree with that definition. But it's the second point. I think it's a matter of, practical point. Assad, who caused all of these havoc in the country, the displacement, the destruction, the chemical weapons, torturing prisoners to death, more than 20,000 by UN estimate, is not likely and contributed into creating ISIS and so on and so forth, will not likely to find a solution, will not likely to be a person who would be constructive in finding a solution to the problem he created. So that's why we have, again, really like a veto against few individuals at the top of the pyramid of this regime that committed all these crimes. And again, we accept the definition of the UN, the Human Rights Council. We accept the Commission of Inquiry. And if they tell us Bashar al-Assad has nothing to do with these crimes, I'm one of those who gladly would accept Bashar in the future of Syria. That, I think, is very important point in the second phase. So in the second phase, as the vision states, going back to that, this transitional governing body would last about 18 months, would create an interim government, would create a military council from all of the forces that are moderate, willing to fight extremists, would set the ground for establishing a constitutional assembly which would draft a new constitution for the country. Their task would end then with a new election of a new parliament. So this is basically the vision, and again, is very consistent with the Geneva Communique, with the UN Security Council resolution, especially 2254, and with the vision presented by the International Syria Support Group. So basically 28 pages of details about our vision of how to end this conflict.
So this is all in the news only today. It's only simply been announced, so you're welcome to read more at your leisure. So speaking of Assad, he, in the summer of 2015, his forces were depleted. They were on the run to some degree, and he inherited a very powerful backer, and that's Russia. So can you talk to us a little bit about Russia's role in this conflict? Why are they involved? Why do they care so much about propping up Assad? And what is their, what's the state of their negotiation with the United States over the future of this conflict?
Thank you. I think this is really an important question. A lot of people would say, why are the Russians so committed to the survival of Assad? I think it's important to look at it in the context of maybe Russia's trying to assert a regional role, an international role, after they lost so many of their presence around the world. I think, and you cannot separate Syria from the other Arab Spring countries. I think when, at one point, Libyan demonstrators were able to, expand and control the eastern part of Libya, Benghazi, if you remember, and Gaddafi threatened to kill all of them. The UN, if you remember again, was able to pass several resolutions in the Security Council, one of them, 1973, which allowed the UN to protect Libyan civilians and to establish no-fly zone. Now, that resolution was passed. Actually, Russia abstained, did not veto that resolution. But from Russia's point of view, it was used for regime change in Libya. And, it was hard for Gaddafi to find many friends around the world. But in the case of Syria, they were watching very closely, and they consider Syria one of the last foothold for them in the region. So there is strategic and historically strategic relations between the Assad regime and Russia. Most of the Assad army is, in fact, get its weapons from Russia historically. But I think the other factor beside Russia's interest in Syria, which are understandable, and those of us in the opposition would like to maintain good relations with Russia in the future, Syria became the maybe place for Putin to assert his legitimacy at home when that started to maybe challenge, but more so to assert his status regionally and internationally through Syria. So, and he took advantage of the fact that you have a weak American administration that was not willing to do much to protect civilians in Syria. So he felt that this is a place maybe to challenge the US. And so again, you have to take Syria into the contest between the US and Russia, what's happening in Ukraine, and what's happening elsewhere. And I think Russia found a regional ally in Iran. So the two countries had a division of labor in terms of who would do what to preserve the Assad regime. So Iran was recruiting these militias, providing the intelligence advisors. Russia would provide the weapons, political cover at the UN, money. And finally, as you said, in 2015, exactly a year ago, Assad was retreating. And there were actually reports, including in this country, that his regime might fall. So Russia intervened directly. They boosted their air force. And since then, they've been carrying out aerial sorties almost, if not on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, against the opposition areas. Even though they claimed to be fighting extremists and ISIS, we have evidence that only 6 to 7% of their target, in fact, address the extremists, while the 93% against the liberated areas and against civilian target, many of them, you mentioned the hospitals, the schools. And so, in a way, in fact, they were able to save Assad's region.
So we are hearing these reports regularly of Russian attacks on civilians. Russia, of course, denies many of these. In your view, are these reports accurate? And why is the targeting of civilians, why does it seem to be so central to Russia's strategy?
Russia doesn't have a history of credibility when it comes to telling the truth. I mean, so many fronts. But again, from the point of view of Russia, and I'm trying to explain this, to them that many of the Islamic groups are not so different from the extremists. So their definition of extremism tends to include, again, a lot of groups. And in their mind, that's fighting terrorism. To us, that's not really something we agree with. Not only us. The international community, the UN, has designated two groups as a terrorist organization in Syria, ISIS and al-Nusra, and we agree with that. Mm-hmm. So targeting these groups are fine. In fact, we have to do something serious, more serious about ISIS than what the international community has been doing, including the US. I mean, when I hear from US sources, it's going to take 10 years to defeat ISIS. I mean, a lot of Syrians would laugh. It's like, really? I mean, an organization of a few thousand, it takes 10 years to defeat? What are you talking about? And we are talking about a coalition of 80 countries. At the top of it is the US. It's ridiculous. And Russia, of course, is part of that. But the point, again, from Russia's point of view, they decided that to side with the Assad regime, to find in Assad's army as the main ally to preserve their interest even for the future. Even though we are in the opposition, reach out to Russia. We visited Moscow so many times. And we try to, again, talk about Russia's interest in Syria and account for it and be willing to discuss everything. But what we learned was it's not about Syria. It's about Russia's wider interest in the region, in the world. It's about Russia's relations with the US. They want, as they say, like a grand bargain that includes every aspect, from Ukraine to the defense missile system in Europe to everything else. And Syria would be one of those bargaining chips. So I think, again, I don't think, the targeting of civilians cannot be justified by Russia as they just want to kill civilians. But, again, when you target these liberated areas, they're mostly civilians. And I think last week, the numbers of Syrians who are killed by Russian Air Force bypassed the numbers of Syrians who are killed by ISIS. It's been a year of air bombardment. And this is, I think, I would refer you to one source, the Syrian Network for Human Rights. I think they published these figures. So the fact of the matter is that they're fighting on the side of the Assad regime and using Air Force. And the main source of killing of Syrians is the Air Force and the barrel bomb.
So what are barrel bombs?
I think we have some pictures. This is one of them. They're literally barrels, containers filled with explosives, metal object thrown at low latitude from helicopters, from, you see them here, from airplanes. And I think these are weapons of, used to really terrorize and kind of create the most havoc wherever they land. Modern armies that respect, human lives, we are moving toward what we call smart weapons, right? It's like, laser guided. You try to, even with the terrorists, that's what we try to do. But I think the Assad's strategy is one to convey a message when they use these weapons, is that if you decide to be liberated, this is what you get. To make life in these areas impossible. To cause the most, again, damage and really force people out of these areas. There is some thinking among the regime circles that they lost some of the territories of Syria and they cannot regain those. So they would try to consolidate the areas they are already controlling. And they have a term for that. They call it the useful Syria. Everything else is useless and deserve to be destroyed. So I think if you look at this is some of the effect of the barrel bombing. So basically, I think from our point of view, one of the demands we have toward the international community is to stop the barrel bombing. If you want to talk peaceful solution, the first step, stop the barrel bombing. Create safe zones. And our ideas of calling for safe zones in the north and the south. Number one, they protect civilians. Number two, you could relocate and resettle refugees, especially in the neighboring countries. You could focus more energy and effort on fighting the extremists and create the conditions to really pursue a political solution. So from our point of view, if we have one immediate demand, is to stop these barrel bombs and the aerial bombardment of Syrians by Russia and by the regime.
Great. So I want to shift our focus a little bit to the United States and its role. You may have heard that there's a presidential election happening in the near future. Can you talk a little bit about what you hear from your point of view in the campaigns of the two presidential candidates and what that suggests to you about what future U.S. policy might look like? To what degree do you think the candidates are giving sufficient attention to Syria and so forth?
Maybe I should make a disclaimer of any affiliation I have so I could speak freely. Well, I think Syria came up in the election in several forms. The most obvious one is as Syria as refugees, as a humanitarian tragedy. And I think the divide seems to be one between that blaming refugees and labeling them as potential terrorists, and we should not accept more of them, unfortunately. I mean, that's one narrative. And the other one being more generous, and it's like, no, we should make a distinction between refugees and terrorists. And in fact, these refugees are the victims of both Assad and the terrorists, and we should be accepting more. So that's one narrative, I think, that came up in the presidential campaigns. But I think the discussion has been, in general, one that's so oversimplified and reductionist in nature. So the second topic, I think, when it comes to ISIS. So again, Syria is reduced into an ISIS-producing country. And in that sense, you have one candidate trying to be tough on ISIS, wanted to, I don't know, get whatever out of ISIS. And another one is trying to present a real, maybe, strategy to really address this problem. But I think in both sides of the arguments, what's missing is addressing the underlying cause of the Syria conflict, which is a political conflict started by a regime that's killing its population, and that produced ISIS and the refugee problems. And I think that's what I haven't heard in both camps. Now, on the camp of Clinton, if I want to be more specific, I think that there has been much more, maybe informed talk when Syria is mentioned. I'm one of those who is critical of the current administration for not doing enough to end the conflict in Syria. And I don't mean military intervention. That's not needed. That was not demanded at any point by Syrians. But I know that when Secretary Clinton was Secretary of State, she wanted to do more. And she advocated the idea of safe zone, which we believe it's very important. And she advocated the idea of supporting the moderate forces. This is before the rise of ISIS. So I think if I were to judge by some of that, I would be encouraged by that kind of line of policy, because that's really what's needed. I do believe that Russia is waiting for the next administration, maybe to deal and to take U.S. seriously. They believe that this administration is, they're just passing time. I mean, I see Secretary Kerry meeting every day with Lavrov, but nothing is coming out. So again, I'm hopeful that a new administration would take Syria very seriously and put Syria as a priority, because this administration has not. And number two, would really do everything to end the conflict in Syria along the effort of the Geneva Communique and the UN resolutions.
So as you note, ISIL, the Islamic State, has dominated discussion in the U.S. about the issues and events in this region. In your opinion, what is an effective strategy for dealing with ISIS and defeating ISIS?
I think that I haven't really seen strategy to defeat ISIS. I think that word has been absent. What's been there, number one, this administration, again, tried to avoid, tried to kind of blind itself to what's really happening. I think I do claim that some of us, as early as 2013, were telling the American officials that there is a growing presence of ISIS in the northwestern part of Syria, and we are fighting that. We need help. We need support. We were not getting, that was not taken seriously. I think ISIS was not taken seriously till they moved from Syria, Raqqa, a town they control, to Mosul, and they shocked and surprised everybody of the strength they had, the capabilities, and they were able to put their hand on a lot of resources, money, weapons, etc., and they became a real threat. The moment that the Obama administration decided to tackle ISIS is that tragic moment when ISIS beheaded the 2 American hostages. And again, I think it was half-hearted policy of airstrikes, then forming a coalition. But I think that a comprehensive strategy to fight ISIS would include, number one, to continue to go after them militarily, seriously, to include the moderate forces in Syria and in Iraq, and especially in Iraq to enlist the Sunnis, because ISIS did have a presence in 2006, 2007, and it was defeated by the awakening tribes and awakening troops in Iraq. Those are mostly Sunnis, moderate. Number 3, I think, and this is what's totally missing, is to acknowledge the political underlying causes that led to the rise of ISIS, and to find a political solution in Syria and in Iraq, to find more inclusive government in Iraq and political solution based on the Geneva Communique. I think this is the link between the political and the military is totally absent from the so-called strategy that the Obama administration and the international coalition are supposed to undertake.
So in a moment, we'll take some questions from the audience. I might ask you one more thing. So I'll just tell the audience there's a microphone there. If you have things you'd like to ask Dr. Ghadbian, please come to the mic, and in a minute we can we'll take a series of questions. So one of the things we hear sometimes is that a partition of Syria might be some kind of, might offer some effective solution to the cycles of conflict and violence. In your opinion, is this a viable solution?
I don't think so. And I think if there is one point of agreement between the opposition and the regime is to keep the territorial integrity of Syria. I think that the International Syria Support Group included that in every statement, maintaining Syria's independence and territorial integrity. That's something we are committed for. In fact, our statement published today had several principles. Maintaining Syria's unity is one of them. I think the problem was not that different groups living in Syria had a question with the map of Syria as much as, it's a historical grievance in the Middle East that the Arabs were divided into different countries, etc. But I think the main issue was the issue of the regime. A regime that did not respond to the interest of the various groups. For instance, in Syria, we have Kurdish community. It's about 8% of the total population. Historically, they've been discriminated against in 2 ways, as Syrians and as Kurds. And I think as part of the revolution, they became part of the mainstream opposition, and we are in the opposition have offered solutions to the Kurdish question that recognize their cultural, linguistic rights, political rights, including them in a meaningful way. We offered in the principles today of the document the principles of administrative decentralization to account for the diversity that exists in Syria. But I think if you open this Pandora box of trying to redraw the map of the region, I think it's going to create a lot of problems. And I don't think this is a right start. Again, to my knowledge, I think we are committed for that. The other side, at least rhetorically committed to it. The international community committed to it. And as I said, what we need is regime states not changing the boundaries of the state.
Right. Thanks. So, are there questions for Dr. Ghadbian? There's a microphone there. So if you would, just identify yourself, what's your role at Elon or in the community is?
Sure. My name is Jess Push. I'm a sophomore, and I'm the Vice President of Elon Partners in International Development. I have a question regarding the European Union and the recent event of Brexit and that type of thing. I was wondering if you could share any opinions you have on how European countries should deal with the mass influx of refugees and asylum seekers while being conscious of the effects on their economy and also the devastating effects of these human beings that are losing their lives in mass quantities.
Thank you. The European Union countries have been actually supportive of our cause. And I think they provided a lot of financial support to Syrians inside Syria. Internationally, at the UN, they've been leading voice in terms of finding political solution that would fulfill the aspirations of Syrians. I would put countries like France, maybe politically at the top of that list. Now, when it came to refugees, I think there was a state of panic in Europe. Some of it is understandable, but I think it was exaggerated in some countries. And I think refugees, we've seen in Europe the best and the worst of humanity. I think we've seen some great images in Germany where people were welcoming Syrians, and we've seen that Hungarian journalist trying to, trip the father with a child. So I think this is normal. But I think countries like Germany, Sweden, France, have been actually more accepting of refugees than our country. Even after the terrorist attack in Paris by ISIS members, I remember the French President Hollande saying, we are committed to receiving 35,000 Syrian refugees, because they made the distinction between the refugees and the terrorists. While immediately we used the same terrorist attack in this country, so 32 governors in this country signed a statement that they would not receive Syrian refugees, even not the 10,000 that accepted by the Obama administration, which is really a very, very modest, small number compared to what we can afford and what we can, sustain. And again, Canada took 100,000, and they're still taking more. So what I'm saying, again, from my point of view, help us end the conflict and resettle most Syrians in Syria. That's really the solution to the refugees' problems. Most Syrians don't want to end up in Spain or Sweden or Norway or Germany. They would love to go back to their homes. Find safe zones for them in northern Syria and southern Syria. And I think there is an obligation on those countries whose refugees reach their borders to treat them humanely and to have a swift process of administering their cases. And I think that some of those countries would benefit economically. I know in Germany, they were smart about it, and there were some studies that these young Syrians would add to the labor force in Germany, an Asian country, that in fact, I think that they accepted about 1 million, not all of them Syrian, I think about maybe 60% of those were Syrians, but they accepted other refugees. So I don't know, I can't really generalize about all of the EU, but as I said, all in all, I think they're trying to deal with this issue, I think, humanely, but they can do better, like everybody else.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Trevor Jones. I'm a sophomore. So from my understanding of the Arab Spring and uprisings in general, when the military defects and switches over to the opposition side, that's when the opposition is usually successful. So I was just curious why only part of the Syrian army defected and why the other half that didn't fracture over to the opposition side.
I think this is a good question. And it has to do with the structure of the Syrian armed forces. Syria has mandatory service in the army. So the majority of the Syrian army does reflect the population of Syria. And so you have most of those, again, soldiers and ranks and files, do represent the majority in Syria. But I think there is, like many authoritarian regimes, there's always elite units. And those elite units are recruited based on loyalty, not on professionalism or to reflect, again, the demographic representation of the country. The elite units in Syria, they do come from the background of the Assad regime, the Assad family. For instance, there is the Republican Guards. More than 95% of them come from that background. And the 4th Division, and definitely the security forces. And this is the work of years of Assad, the father and the son, to make it that way. So what we've seen is that, and of course those elite units enjoy most of the privileges, and they are definitely much more important than the average army, if you will. So what we've seen, defection from the average armies. I mean, the armies that come, from the same neighborhoods that they were ordered to kill and ordered to use violence against. So I would say that it is true that today those loyalist units continue to be the major base of Assad. But what I want to say too is that they suffered a great deal of losses. I think the figures that people use, about 70,000 of those loyal units have been lost. I mean, and so there's, again, the other side is suffering, And I think the difference between us and the regime, people ask, and sometimes when you have conflicts like, people are killing each other, and I feel it's totally unfair to characterize, any conflict like that. I think the difference between us and the regime is, the big one is that we care about those who are killed from the other side, because they are Syrians. But I've never heard Assad acknowledging our point of view or acknowledging us anything but terrorists. And I think that's a major problem. I mean, until they come to recognize that other Syrians are human beings and they have a legitimate point of view and they have aspirations and they have to be included, this is the point at which we go to those negotiations as equal. I think people ask me, what's your major concession as an opposition? I say, the fact that I'm willing to negotiate with the Assad regime, despite all of the atrocities that it's committed. 97% of those killed at the Assad regime. And I'm still willing to accept that they have a legitimate perspective and they are our partner in the future of Syria, and they should not all be treated the same way. You know what I mean? So I think that's maybe the main reason behind. And this issue of the composition of the army goes historically a long time, to the days of the French, actually, French mandate, which created that division in Syria.
Great. There. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Zach. I'm a first year here at Elon. And I'd like to bring the conversation back to the refugee crisis just for a minute. Morally, it's our responsibility to take in as many Syrian refugees as possible. It's a sort of respect thing, a respect for human life, but at the same time, you have to accept the fact that terrorist organizations such as ISIS, who are so committed to being against the Western world, will do whatever it takes to hurt us. So with the ability to take in Syrian refugees, it also presents a significant risk to the American population. So given that risk, do you think that it's still our responsibility to take in refugees?
Thank you. No, I totally accept the security concern that must be taken very seriously. And you're absolutely right. I mean, they would try to do everything. But I think one of the ways that ISIS will not do is to try to infiltrate the refugees, based on the fact that it's a very scrutinized process to become a refugee and to register refugees at that. And I think the record proves that. I think somebody mentioned that of something like 780,000 cases of refugees who came to this country since 9/11, there were 3 cases of suspected link to terrorism. So, based on that record, I would assure you that, again, this is not one of the easy ways for the ISIS to try to infiltrate countries like the US. And I think I would give credit to the various agencies in these countries that are doing meticulous work to scrutinize refugees who already have to go through one of the most prolonged process of scrutiny by the United Nations. And I think people who examine that, really address this question very reasonably. The problem is, in the public discussion and especially in an election year, it's just there is really no informed discussion of those issues. I mean, how many brought up the actual facts about it, But to say easily, like, oh, Syrian refugees are equivalent of terrorists. Oh, of course we don't want them. Those who carried out terrorist attacks in France were French citizens, born in France, second-generation European Muslims who were not integrated in that country. The same in Brussels, the same in, look in this country. We had two cases that were influenced by ISIS, the California shooting and the Florida. The Florida guy was so confused that he pledged allegiance to ISIS, Nusra, and Hezbollah. Two groups are fighting each other. So I think that in this country we are lucky because we do a better job integrating immigrants than Europeans, and I think that should encourage us to accept more. We can accept more. Again, I'm all for all the scrutiny you want to go through. Take your time, do everything you have to do, and then, but again, 10,000 is really nothing compared to what we can do. But more importantly, let's help with the political solution in Syria and resettle Syrians inside Syria.
Thanks, please.
Good evening. I'm Karen Morose. I'm part of the Life at Elon group, which for those who may not know is the senior group, I guess, that take classes here. And I've worked for the last decade with Palestinian refugees and most recently Syrian refugees in Jordan. One group that you did not mention in this is there's a fairly large population of Palestinian refugees in Syria, and camps like Yarmouk have been devastated. Where do they fall in this? And the second thing is Damascus was, for a long period of time, the headquarters for Hamas. I heard you mention Hezbollah. Where is Hamas falling in all of this?
Thank you, and thank you for your work with refugees. I think we need more people to do that kind of work. I think on the Palestinian Syrians, many of them suffered like the average Syrians, especially you mentioned Al-Yarmouk. Al-Yarmouk was the site of a major attack by the government, by the regime. And I don't know, there's that famous picture of, people, if you could look it up, in the Yarmouk camp of people who were under siege. And this is the moment when the UN had the first shipment to the Yarmouk camp. Most Palestinian, Syrian Palestinian were on the side of the revolution. And that's why they were targeted. And many of them had to go through, again, another refugees, experience. And this is a picture I was talking about at the Yarmouk camp. They were under siege, like the 600,000 still under siege for the third year. Hamas, I think, from the first days of the revolution, decided to be neutral. Even though they were supported by the Assad regime, they realized the scope of the uprising in Syria. And so they did not want to be in a position to choose sides. In fact, they decided to leave Damascus, their leadership. Many of them went to other countries. And I think on many occasions, some of them expressed feelings of sympathy toward the Syrian people. And some of them went as far as condemning the Syrian regime's atrocities, which restrained their relations with Iran. So I would say that the comparison between Hamas and Hezbollah is an interesting one, that again, the Hamas was much more closer to the Syrian people, while Hezbollah unfortunately acted as a faction under the Iran Revolutionary Guards and took direct role in the fighting in Syria, especially in the center, on the border, and carried out atrocities against Syrians, unfortunately. And it's lost a great deal of respect and sympathy among Syrians. I think the sectarian dimension played a role because the regime, especially Iran, uses the sectarian line to recruit a lot of people. You ask a lot of those who come from Iraq, Afghanistan, Hezbollah, why are you fighting in Syria? We're here to protect the family of the Prophet. There is one site in Damascus called Sid Zainab, which is the daughter of Hussein. That's holy for the Shia. That's the only site really of significance. But that site has been always respected, protected, kept, even, the Sunni respected. So, but it's been used again in the politics of sectarianism, which I must say not only Iran uses, but sometimes Gulf countries uses that, unfortunately. The conflict in Syria is not Shia Sunni, because we have a very, very small Shia group, a minority, 2 villages, and some population in Damascus and Aleppo. And I think those countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia at the regional level are trying to turn it into a sectarian conflict. And I think it's not in the interest of anyone to turn it into that kind of conflict.
So we haven't had a chance to talk much yet about Iran's role and what their stake in this is. If there is such a small Shia population, why is Iran so centrally involved?
I think it's a good question. Syria for Iran has been strategic in terms of its regional role. I would go back to maybe 1979 when the Iranian Revolution took place in Iran. It was received with a great deal of suspicion in most of the Arab countries. And except in Syria, I think Assad, the father, was one of the first leaders to welcome the revolution. And from Assad's point of view, Iran could become a potential ally, which actually it did. So when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, all of the Arab countries sided with Iraq, except Syria sided with Iran. That allowed Assad to get a lot of economic benefits and forge strategic relations between the Assad regime and Iran. That relationship in the mid-'80s evolved to the creation of pro-Iranian groups in Lebanon, most prominently Hezbollah. So Syria became a bridge to protecting the Shia community in Lebanon, particularly Hezbollah. All the weapons, the money goes through Syria. So when the revolution happened, Iran, interestingly enough, all the Arab Spring happened. They welcomed that in Egypt, they welcomed it in Tunisia, they welcomed it in Bahrain, but not in Syria. So they had to pause there. And immediately when they felt that the Assad regime was under threat, they provided first security advisors, then military advisors, then they increased money, then we started to see more involvement on their side. I talked to some Iranians, and some of them clearly believe it's not about the Shia thing. They don't believe Assad is a man of religion, but a man of power, and they see it as just protecting their interests, clearly. And I think when the other side, Saudi and Turkey, take the side of the opposition, it becomes, again, part of the regional competition.
Yeah. Great. So we can take one more question, maybe, if there is one. And then I'd like to call on a couple students to make announcements.
Hi, my name is Liz. I'm a first year. What is it do you think that we can do to help? Because I feel like we hear so much and it's such a big problem that we kind of just don't know where to start ourselves.
Thank you for this maybe last question. I think it's very appropriate to end with that. I think a lot can be done. I would begin by saying learn more about Syria and the region. And I think once you know more, you can make informed decisions about how and what to do. But I think on the humanitarian side, again, a lot can be done. I think you mentioned you could volunteer to help settle refugees in this country. You can help by collecting maybe support for Syrians, by lobbying to end the conflict in Syria, by electing someone who is willing to do something about Syria and bring the kind of peaceful solution and end the humanitarian catastrophe. It's the worst since World War II, according to the UN. What else? Yeah, that's a lot, you know. But again, I really believe that there's not enough discussions about that important conflict that affect all of us. So I want to take the opportunity again to thank the Elon community, all the professors, those who invited me to talk about Syria, and for you to have more events like this. So I want to thank you all for doing this, inviting me.